Kia ora and welcome to the 2024 Changing Threads Contemporary Textile and Fibre Art Awards. And it's very exciting this year. This is our 15th year, and so I think we've got a real showcase for everybody here with lots of surprises. To actually have a piece within the show is actually quite tricky in itself, because this year, for example, we had 180 entries, and we have two other selectors with myself. We had Leanne Edwards and Joe Kinross, and by photographs we selected down to 62 works. So from there, those 62 works then arrive into the gallery and we make a further selection. So the first selection took us 9.5 hours over 2 days, so it's not a quick process. So when the actual work arrives, and we very carefully consider all sorts of things, such as the actual execution of the work, which is really important to us, and how it's going to work in the gallery space. So we selected those 62 down to 49, and that's what we now present to you here. I think every year it's a little different as far as maybe the colours of the show, or sometimes it's a theme or a concept which comes through quite strongly. And for me, looking at the overall exhibition this year, I think it's very much about a sense of place, who we are as New Zealanders. And I think the way the world is, I think it's very important that we all have that sense of who we are and what it is we want to say about ourselves to the rest of the world. So I think there's a lot of work with great integrity here. There's quirky work, there's some work with some very deep philosophical backgrounds, some work that has very personal aspects, and so it's a show that has something to offer for everybody, and I hope you really enjoy it as you walk through. So these are two entries by Cara Burrows. Now Cara is actually a painter as well, and we feel that her work, both of the entries here, have a real painterly quality. She's used different weights of the threads by splitting them, and some of them are super fine and some are heavier, and so it really gives a very interesting textural element to the whole piece. By presenting them as she has, it really focuses your eye in on the work, and it reminded us of old slides or photograph mounting, so it's a precious thing held within. So both beautiful works, but we think they played off each other really well as two entries side by side. So this is an entry by Judith Luffley, who's from Oamaru, and she's collected different types of kelp when she's up on the Opotiki coast. Her work is very much fascination with selkies and mysticism, and she absolutely loves the shapes that are created as the kelp starts to dry. So her process is quite elaborate because she needs to wash the kelp before she uses it, and she only has 48 hours before it's not able to be used at all. So the shaping of these, she felt very much reflected in Celtic knots and patterning of the time, and then the whole piece needs to be sealed once it's done, otherwise it starts to deteriorate quite quickly. So it's a really quirky interpretation of fantasy footwear. This piece by Michelle Main has a cocoon-like structure, and it shows that something quite simple can really have quite a presence because there's a real quiet energy around it. So she has a piece of Pohutakawa root inside the work, and then the weaving around it really holds it within. And we found it was a place for reflection. It really marks a moment. It's a moment of place, and it has quite a powerful presence when you just stand here and just reflect upon it. So yes, surprisingly elegant work. These two beautiful pieces by Rowan Holt, a poem for forest and poem for ocean. And so she's used the waxed linen thread here, and inside that she has various pieces of ferns and forest floor materials. But the weaving is very clever because within the layers, she has a very traditional European, interesting interpretation of Maori weaving. They're two separate entries, but they hang beautifully together and very well presented, and the whole thing was thought through very carefully. This piece by Samara Davis is very intriguing. So Samara is a young Maori woman who has been connecting with her heritage, and her work has very deep thought patterns behind them. So here she has some beautiful taniko weaving on the neck piece, and all of the leaves have actually got a coating of the varnish. So she's talking about colonization and the effects of what's actually left behind on a culture when colonization happens, the good and the bad, and various other things with what's left behind. This very beautiful piece by Briar Van Dort shows a real contemporary interpretation of traditional techniques. So Briar's recently moved to Nelson from the North Island, and she was telling us about how this has been very much a part of the work she's been working with her study. So it's called Wairua, and she read us a very moving poem called Wairua, which is all about heart and home. So this area here, she has a very European twist. It's almost like the old knotted cables and things that we found in fishing villages, parts of England. And here is the more traditional muka, but the whole thing is so perfectly executed and hangs beautifully. So it's not meant to be a kurawai, it's meant to be the piece that hangs more across the front. So we think it's really reflective of an excellent piece of work. This delightful little diptych by Sarah Reed is beading taken to the extreme. Absolutely beautiful work. So Sarah was very intrigued when she found that every zebra foal has a different patterning, and that every zebra foal, of course, knows its mother. So she found that in the wildlife safari parks, the keepers were actually wearing jackets that were imprinted with certain patterns so that the foals always know who their mother is or who's feeding them as far as the keeper. So this was presented so beautifully because, as well as the exquisite beading, with the gold edge, your eye moves backwards and forwards within the two pieces. And so it really creates quite an intriguing dialogue between the two pieces. This intriguing piece by Robin Walton is called Make Work. And at first glance, it looks like a roll of Chuck's cloth, you know, cleaning women's work type thing. But it's absolutely amazing when you look closely because she's actually embroidered the whole thing. So every part of this has been painstakingly worked through to make it look as if it is the Chuck's cloth, but it's presented beautifully with even the towel holder has been formed so the work hangs. It's so precious and so beautifully done. So this delightful piece by Kim Lawrence is really, really well executed, but it also speaks to all those childhood books we had which hold dear to our hearts. And so when Kim's made the piece, she's even kept the covers as if they're not quite straight, as a book would be if it was well loved. And we thought that the addition of the overdue library card just really sets it off to perfection. This delightful piece by Fleur Woods brings back all the memories of going rose picking with her family up on the hills around Nelson. Really elaborate, the very almost joyous quality of the work, very, very heavily embroidered, but the more you look, the more you see in the little movements and the French knots. So it's a very energized piece. So held within the frame, it makes it very precious and draws your eye inwards. So really, really well executed and a delight to look at. This piece by Sian Torrington is really exuberant and it just breathes life. So real outsider art, and I think it's very important to include work which isn't necessarily beautiful on its first look, but the more you look, the more intrigued you become. Lots of little areas of very fine stitching. There's pieces of fabric which draw you in and you want to explore more so. We just thought it was really fun, and of course it talks to a lot of wrapped threads that are being done in art, people like Sheila Hicks and Marion Coutard. You know, there is quite a heritage of wrapping of threads in textile art, and this is done in a very contemporary way and almost reminds you of some of the outsider art like Basquiat and people like that. So spontaneous and joyful is the way we thought of this. This intriguing piece by Letitia Williams has got a really beautiful sculptural quality. So she's used wrapping in different threads and cords. Along the main part, she has a very strong branch, and she was telling us that her father was regarded as being a tonga, a treasure of knowledge within her whole area that she lives in the middle of the North Island, or at the top of the North Island. And so she's carried that feeling of knowledge through. And with the little threads going everywhere, it's all about how knowledge ekes out. I was always a great fan of Arthur Rackham drawings, and so it reminded me of that sort of Russian fairy tales and things. And with the stitching that she's done on the underneath piece here, lots and lots of fine layers. So it's got a real forest floor feeling to it. So the different threads, the different shadow play, it means the whole piece works very well as a sculptural whole. And it's how knowledge is kept together, because we need to spread the knowledge, because otherwise we lose it. And I think that's very well captured in this whole work. So Maggie J has always been very concerned with the materiality of what she uses. So for here, she's taken what she perceives as being a very masculine material, the wire, and treated it with the feminine skills of the knitting. So she's knitted areas of the copper wire here, and with the shapes and patterns over the whole piece. So we really love the sketchy quality. Again, the shadow plays to perfection in this piece, but it has a feeling of exuberance and a mark making which really holds the whole sculptural work together. This is the first of two exceptional entries by Deb Shepherd. This is the Queen Viv and obviously Vivienne Westwood, and just totally spontaneous. We really love Deb's attention to detail on all the pieces, and even on the ribbons on the outside framing. You know, she's stitched in various words and things that Viv Westwood was actually known to be involved in. But the fine detailing in the work is just beautiful. And as a whole piece, it's got a real sense of impact, and it does carry that spontaneity that she was so known for. So this delightful entry is by David Carson, who's more known in the area for his work with wood or metal blades. So he's really created an interesting piece with this fruit suit for dinner with the boss, and he means Bos Taurus, the other name for cattle. But the attention to detail is really fun, even complete to the piece of fruit leather in the pocket, but has almost like a contemporary Magritte flavour to it with the bowler hat and the briefcase. So really delightful, and the harakiki just gives a sense of energy and movement to the whole work. So really absolutely delightfully quirky. So this piece by Frankie Meaden really has a very intriguing use of materials. So she has rope, some of it is plastic, and some of it is in a more raw form. And she has art flags that she's torn and stripped. And the whole thing has been stitched into a piece of fishing net. So it's got quite a robust framework, but it has a real exuberance of flowers. And when you're looking at pieces such as Fleur Wood's little delicate work we looked at earlier, it's delightful to see something on a totally different scale that also has a lot of energy behind it. So very Monet-like, and yeah, really enjoyed this piece. This beautiful piece by Abby McCall has a really subtle beauty. It's actually made from painted and repurposed vinyl blinds from vertical blinds. So each one of them has actually been taken and stripped, and there's wax cord and beads inside to hold the whole thing level, but it really does look at beneath the surface, the undulation of the waves and the water movement. And the more you moved back and forward to it, your eye is drawn in and drawn out, and really experience it in a different way from different angles around the gallery. So it's a beautiful work. So this lovely work by Esther Bunning actually refers to going raspberry picking with her father, who's obviously starting to be in the early stages of dementia. So she's printed a picture of the raspberries from the raspberry picking, which was such a thing that they did together, and she's printed it onto a piece of silk georgette, which has then been torn. And with the loose threads, we know all about cerebral unwinding through the whole process. So your eye is led through the work into the shadows behind, and you see the threads that are not quite meeting up there. And it really has a sense of the time she spent with him collecting the raspberries. And even in the picture of the raspberries on the surface, it's the little hard ones and then the overripe pieces. So it's a memory of a life well lived. So Sarah Ritchie has given us a masterful piece of wall felting. And the more you look into it, the more it reminds you of a Cubist painting, with both the angles, the colour palette, and the fact your eye moves around the work and in to investigate some areas more than others. So the sheep themselves are quite strong in the center, but then your eye continually moves around into the hills behind them. So it was really lovely to see a less used technique such as needle felting being taken into the art form. So it's a beautifully presented piece of work, and we really enjoyed seeing something that was quite different. This delightful piece by Rachel Ratton is called The Point of a Rat, and it's so well worked. It is quirky, it's humorous. We loved the play on proportion. So it's been worked on a piece of recycled fabric, so it's almost like an old Sanderson type fabric in the background, but the use of some of the subtle elements of colours within it draws your eye in around it. The proportion between the Mr. Trump figure and the rat are quite humorous as well as some of the other illusions are. We loved the length of the hand reaching out towards the ratty, and the whole thing has a sense of humour, but it's also a sense of foreboding. But beautifully worked, and it was a very strong contender for a prize of excellence. So Helen Bevan's work here is referring to her love of craft work since she was a young person. So when she was very small, she tried macrame, which she tells us she wasn't at all good at. But she's taken those knots from the macrame heritage and technique and translated them into her quilted work. So she's doing some really exceptional quilting work. And I think this is a very strong and powerful piece, simply presented, but it really has a lovely framework in the length of the work and the proportions. Stephanie Campbell, Is This You, Is This Me, has presented her work on a tea towel, an ordinary dishcloth, and it's all about women's friendships, and there's whole sorts of little faces here and tiny details. It's the friendships that we have as we're washing the dishes, as we're sitting having a cup of tea together, the good bits, the bad bits, and there's lots of humorous allusions through some areas and some parts where you think, well, I'm glad I don't have a friend like that. So quite fun, really worth engaging with, and the lovely little details such as the little pearl buttons and the extra bits of cross stitch over the surface just makes it a piece that you want to engage with a bit of a wry smile on your face. So these are actually two entries by Patricia Fung, but they're along the same idea and the same concept. So they're dealing with mutation, and quite intriguing with these two pieces because at first glance it can be quite repellent, but then your eye is intrigued and you want to come and investigate further. And the more you look closely, the more you realize that this mutation is actually really quite beautiful in lots of ways. There's some really subtle detailing, tiny stitching, the way things are manipulated and bent. It's not quite as simple as it seems to be on the first glance. And even details such as the zip across the head, it's been really well thought through. And the oversized mosquito has this sense of foreboding. And the more you look back from the gallery and come towards it, the shadow is actually really enhancing that whole feeling of dread. So some very intriguing pieces of work. This lovely piece, Pam McKinley, is beautiful. The actual piece is called Don't Eat the Pink Snow, and it's talking about the algal bloom on the Arctic ice and how you can see it even from space. And the more of this algal bloom that's on the ice, there's more ice deteriorating. So the name, of course, is a bit of a play on the skiers' joke about don't eat the yellow snow, but this is don't eat the pink snow. And when you look at the processes that she's used and the eye moves through it, so it's very delicate, but it has that real shimmer of ice. So it's a beautiful work. So this piece by Marina McPherson was a total change of direction for her. Marina's known for her exquisite embroidery, and here she's given us a piece which really wrenches at the heart. So it's a medic's first aid bag. And as she was talking to us about the fact that with the Geneva Convention, of course, the red cross on the white would generally indicate a medic, but to actually have that, sometimes that would mean that you were a target. So she's used the camouflage colours of the Army Medic Corps there. And on here she has a photograph of her grandfather who was also a medic, and it's been printed onto a piece of bandage and with the Pack Up Your Old Troubles here, and the poem that we all know. And it's a really powerful little piece. So well done, Marina, for really trying something quite different that gives us a very strong impression of the work. This is the second entry by Deb Shepherd, who gave us the beautiful Viv Westwood piece earlier, and it's another example of the mastery that Deb has over her materials. It's women's work, and the finger in the air with the thimble we thought was real sense of fun and a sense of energy and movement. So we look at closer and closer into Deb's work. It's all set so beautifully. She really thinks through every part of it, and it's an exquisite work. So this piece by Christopher Sandoval is very interesting in the way he's used his processes. So it's a knitted piece, and then we have the latch hooking, and it's about our bodies as we sag, as we get older, and the marks that come upon it. And there are some really beautiful marks happening through here as it hangs and sags from its poles. And both sides are slightly different, so it's worth going around the other side to have a look at that from that side as well. This wonderfully quirky piece by George Peter is a commentary about the political situation. So just before the last election, he was looking at billboards around Christchurch where he lives and his own opinions about what things were. And some of the more well-known characters in politics are all portrayed here in his mainly long and short stitch embroidery that he's used, and he tells us he's self-taught, but we thought the whole thing presented on this tea towel, which he just happened to have in his kitchen obviously, has got a well-used feeling, and it just gives a quirkiness to the whole work. This is the second entry by George Peter, and this is a memorial piece for him. So he had a very dear friend he lost a year or so back, and part of their whole ritual growing up was to actually share a smoke. And because it's not necessarily the done thing these days, he said they used to go outside and smoke when they were at work. And so the whole ritual of the lighting the cigarette, the smoking, and then having the butts was very much part of their friendship. And so this was a little honorium to that whole memory of that friendship. And again, in a very quirky, simple presentation where they've just been done straight onto a piece of fabric that he happened to have. So it has a real sense of presence and energy. That Slabbit's work here shows another piece that's been very well resolved and is beautifully presented. And her work is about saving the whole idea of torchon lace and some of these lesser known lace techniques which are starting to disappear. And she's presented them in a very strong contemporary way. The whole image is beautifully centered within the work, and each area has a lovely subtlety, but it's also very strong, almost like a Modigliani shape to the face, and so it draws you into it, be far more intrigued than just a cursory glance going past. So beautiful work. And it's so important that things like the torchon lace skills are kept alive, and I think it's work such as this that is going to do that. Adele McNutt has given us a delightful little quirky piece of self-portrait aged 4, and it rather reminded us of Susan Lickman's paintings and that sense of slice of life feeling. Your eye moves straight through the piece to the little girl and probably onto the interior beyond. It's that thing about everyday life but captured with a moment, and Adele's little signature is to always want to have one of our ubiquitous traffic cones in her work. So the slight quirkiness of the angles also gives added interest to the piece, and by having it presented in such a simple way, it really doesn't need anything more than what she's done, which has really given us an interesting piece of work. So this intriguing piece by Min Young He is a young Korean artist, and her work is using her own hair. So she's plaited and twisted hair, and we actually have 82 meters of her hair wound around, and different aspects that she gave us in the photographs where the hair was actually put into large circles and hooked up, but this part that she decided to send was just to be kept very simple. So it has an elegance, but it's certainly very intriguing with the storyline behind the use of the hair in Korean culture. So this piece is by Kate Seller, who won our Supreme Award last year, and it's called Biological Corruption, and it's all to do with bacteria and viruses. And what we really like with Kate's work is that she doesn't try and make it go into a shape that it doesn't want to do it. She just allows it to let it do its own thing. And with all the stitching, and of course it distorts, and with the movement of the different lines through here, your eye travels around and starts to look at the very intriguing little pieces here. Lots of beautifully fine detail, and your eye comes in to really explore. And the use of threads with the use of other bits of fabric in behind, and it has that real biological growth. So some of the use of 3D imagery of pieces in here, it's very intriguing, but and the more you move around, the light hits it in different ways, but lots of really interesting details. So this piece is another work which shows us that presentation is really important. So Giles Panting had been one of our prize winners last year, and he presented another piece here which was a very strong contender for the Benina Award. So the whole piece is encased in a Victorian museum display work, and that's how he's presented the work as well. So it's to do with the cultural side of things, where the painter Goldie, who had not realised he was being offensive, has just a simple 2 or 3 tiki that his portraits all wear, which was very insulting really, because all the different iwi groups have their own tiki patterns. And so Giles has taken that whole understanding of that colonisation of things such as the tiki, and he's presented them in this very beautiful way, as if they were almost Victorian display pieces. And your eye is then brought forward into the tiny pins, the way they're displayed with the words and the naming as well. The whole thing is very well thought through, and it's a beautiful piece of work. So Alison Midgelow Marsden is really intrigued with the whole metallic look that you can get from fabrics and different materials. And here she's given us a very beautiful sculptural work. The shadow play is very important to the work as it hangs on the wall, because you really move forward and back through the work, through the little gaps in the whole holes in here and round that shadow area. So you are quite intrigued with the actual composition of the work, and also engaged in the shaping of the work. Lisa Mathis has these 3 little pieces, which are 3 separate entries, and so each one is presented with a space around it, but as a whole they also worked exceptionally well. So How to Mend a Broken Bone, 1, 2 and 3, and each one of these is an exquisite little exploration, because they have pieces of fabric that have been printed and written on. There's tiny little bits of paper clay, and these fine filigree, which could be veins or they could be little arteries, but each one of them is really perfect, and they have a real sense of presence. So I think it is very important to note that the work doesn't have to be a large piece to actually make an impact. So Sue Hayden has been one of our repeat entrants since the very beginning of Changing Threads, and Sue always gives us a piece of work which is very interesting, very well resolved, and has a very strong concept, and that's exactly what she's done here. So this work is very much an installation piece, where the fibre content of the textile is probably on its minimal side, but as an installation work, I think it's really important that we keep stretching things, and she certainly has done that here. So it's about her great-grandmother's difficult life, and when she came out from from England years ago, and the effects on the family when one of the family members was lost. And so the scarring on the table and then the stitching is to try and repair that loss to the family, but that was never quite able to do so. The little necklace on the back wall here has the little metal chaffinch tail feathers and wing feathers that she's formed. And when the pioneers came out and the early settlers, there were cages and cages of birds were brought with them, and I didn't know that until Sue was telling us about this, and I looked it up. And so thousands of them came, and obviously thousands of the birds were lost on the way. So these are to represent the feathers of those birds, and done on a piece of harakeke with a Victorian boot button, just as part of the closure of the piece, in the candle for a sense of memory. And this stand here has the book that Sue has prepared, which is all about her family history, showing the table and the scarring and with a lot more detail. So it's a very well-rounded and well-thought piece of work. So this piece by Susie Peacock, we're hanging it both ways so you can explore both sides, and it's utilising pieces of precious old kimono and the fact that things like old kimonos that are very treasured and they've still got a real sense of presence with them. We love the way that this piece of light comes through this fabric. It really gives a sense almost like moonlight and makes you want to draw yourself in. There's lots of little details, fine stitching here to hold the pieces but allow for the movement forward and back. And we really liked the loose threads left behind, so there's been stitched through from the other side and the threads hanging. So on the other side there's a lot more colour, there's a lot more brightness through it, but again you've got those very precious strips of the kimonos, so it's an intriguing work. This is a very special piece by Sarah Arnold. So a few years ago, she had an exhibition piece in Changing Threads with her friend Catherine Salmon. So Catherine was a very well-known tutor in the Nelson Polytech art department and a great mentor and friend to many. And she had been an entrant in Changing Threads many times, and she and I had had exhibitions together. And Sarah and Catherine had had an exhibition piece where they'd used the handkerchiefs hanging on long threads, and it was to represent the young soldiers who'd died in the Tapawera area. And so when Catherine died, Sarah decided she would reuse and repurpose some of those handkerchiefs into a piece as a memorial for her friend. So the handkerchiefs have been formed into small pockets or envelopes, and within them are different things, little mementos. It could be little letters from Catherine, little quirky pieces, even including the little bird, because Catherine really loved birds, and different aspects of their friendship. So it's a very powerful memorial to a very special person. So sometimes when we have entries that are a little bit challenging or may actually touch a personal chord, sometimes it can be very tempting to think, oh, we won't show that as part of the exhibition. But I think it's really important to actually continue to grow by showing the public work which isn't necessarily what they would hope to see, but indeed sometimes what they need to see. And so this piece by Catherine Parkinson is about the loss of a baby, a loss of a child. And I think for a lot of people in this day and age with infertility and other things, it's really important to acknowledge that that can be a real gap in people's lives. So when we were placing that in the exhibition space, we've chosen to put it within this part of the gallery with a seat here as a contemplative space. So if people choose not to engage with it, they can then move forward and move on with the rest of the exhibition. But it allows people some time to stop and maybe have a reflective response to the work. And it's very important to have work like that that's being seen to really stretch what it is you're thinking about within a gallery space. This little piece by Birgit Moffat was actually one of our prizes for our Award of Excellence with our new sponsor, Harcourts. And so she's made this exquisite muka and twisted it, and it's drawn out. And then she's used basketry techniques to hold the base together. So each one is actually positioned carefully upon the rocks. So they're not actually attached to the rocks, they're just balanced. And very much what the balance of life. And so we really liked that hard, soft contrast. And we liked the way that with the twist of the muka, it has real movement. And your eye is continually engaged around the work. You want to walk around and explore it from different angles. And we really thought that the shadows on this really enhanced the whole work. This piece by Tracy Sullivan won our other award of excellence, which is sponsored by Dame Susie Moncrief and New Zealand Textile Experiences. And it's a piece that shows how a presentation can just make a piece work incredibly well. Everything about this work is well resolved and thought through. It's a beautiful process that she's followed through. The framing is echoed within the actual work itself. So she's stitched onto a piece of atlas paper. So she's painted on the atlas paper, and we know it was the atlas with the page number and the word of the World Index on it. And then she stitched part of one of her poems onto the work. So not only would the actual process have been very difficult, but it really draws you in and makes you quite intrigued about what is that poem, what is it saying, and it's got a real sense of place and presence. So very, very beautiful work. This piece by Janet Bathgate is called 010405 Under the Microscope, and it's actually the winner of our Bernina Award. So the Bernina Award goes to a piece of work which actually uses the sewing machine in an interesting or creative way, and this is certainly doing that. It's a masterful way of playing with the stitches by twisting and distorting, so it's the tension playing. But as well as what the use of the machine is, it's actually got an interesting feeling on the whole thing. It's well composed. You have the structure and composition underneath that actually grounds the whole work. And the areas in the background here are also worked in darker colours. So it draws your eye inwards, but at the same time your eye then spirals out to some of these smaller areas. So Janet was saying she's using a rag paper to give enough strength to be able to stitch into. So each of these pieces is like a tiny little microcosm of a virus. The loose threads over the whole thing also keep your eye moving around, and you have this whole feeling of little bacteria and platelets and viruses. So very intriguing piece of work. So this piece by Michaela Curtis called A Whole Story in the Eye of the Sea was actually our supreme winner this year, which was very intriguing to a lot of people because we have some absolute showstoppers of pieces of work in the whole exhibition. But what it actually does is it actually makes your eye stop and consider that a work doesn't have to be a showcase and be powerful to be intriguing. So Michaela has printed the work beautifully on these organza pages. So your eye moves forward and back because of the transparency, and it really draws you in. So when we were doing the judging and we moved around and around and around, we were all drawn back to this piece because it was intriguing and it showed that a quiet work can also have a lot of power and strength, and it really does warrant quite a beautiful moment to actually engage in the work.